This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this episode 838 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. This week's schedule is a little bit funky because of Thanksgiving. Today, you're obviously getting the 15 Transactions episode. That's what you're listening to right now. Tomorrow, you'll get two shows. You'll get the 10 Trends episode that's going to drop in the morning as it usually does, and then I'll get the Sleepers episode out as soon as I can in the afternoon. That way you have everything you need before the games start on Thanksgiving. But there won't be a mailbag episode or a late round perspectives episode this week. That'll be the case for me in a couple of weeks as well, but we'll get to that when the time comes. For now, let's talk about some transactions. Sell Joe Mixon. So the Cincinnati Bengals offense without Joe Burrow is obviously going to be a lot worse than an offense with Joe Burrow. And even if the Bengals become more run heavy without Burrow, Joe Mixon still gets a rest of season downgrade. I talked about this last week on the mailbag episode. When it comes to projections, you should take a top-down approach. You start at the team level and then work into the player level. And if the team level looks bad, as it does for Cincinnati, or at least looks worse, that's bad for all players on that team. Now, to be clear here, I'm not always an advocate of just selling players when their quarterback gets injured. The market will often overreact to situations like this. I mean, Garrett Wilson, even though he had a bad week 11, he's had a better season than most probably projected when Aaron Rodgers went down. And I think that's probably the case for someone like Jamar Chase. With Joe Mixon, though, there is some concern. He's coming off a big performance. Maybe you could sell high as a result. He's now finished as a top 10 PPR running back in 3 of his last 4 games. And that's because he's had a touchdown in all 4 of those games. That's pretty unlikely to maintain. We should not expect Joe Mixon to score a touchdown every single week, especially without Joe Burrow. But not only that, Cincinnati running backs have a pretty brutal fantasy football playoff schedule. They'll get the Vikings, then the Steelers, and the Chiefs in weeks 15, 16, and 17. Minnesota and Kansas City are bottom 10 matchups by adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs. And Pittsburgh's about average. And you'd imagine a game against the Steelers that late in the season, a divisional rival, that's probably going to be a lower scoring game. Even if your trade deadline's already passed, it's important to temper expectations with Joe Mixon. Buy Nico Collins. So right now, the fantasy football world is rightfully obsessed with Tank Dell. Because Tank Dell's a monster. He's been a beast. Over his last 3 games, he's averaged 11.7 targets per game, 106.3 yards, and 25.8 PPR points. Tank Dell is looking like a league-winning player. And that's not a phrase that I use very often. While everyone's obsessed with Tank Dell, though, don't forget about Nico Collins. After missing week 10, Collins re-entered the picture in week 11, and he saw 28.9% target share. He's averaged about a 22% target share per game rate this year. That gives him a nice projection week in and week out in this pass-friendly offense. Texans wide receivers have a pretty good rest of season schedule too. According to adjusted fantasy points allowed, Texans wideouts have the best median opponent during weeks 15 through 17. And that makes sense because they get the Tennessee Titans twice. Tennessee's the 3rd best opponent for wide receivers within that metric. Now, sandwiched between those 2 games against Tennessee is one against Cleveland. That's not a great matchup. But with everyone focused on Tank Dell right now, this could be the time to get Collins a little bit cheaper than he should go for. Add Isaiah Likely. Look, no one can replace Mark Andrews 1-for-1. The Ravens are going to do their best to replace him with a variety of their weapons. And that starts with Isaiah Likely. He only had an 8.7% target share against Cincinnati this past week, but his route participation was almost 90%. That's an elite number at tight end. So if Likely keeps running a route at that pace, he's likely, you get it, going to be usable in fantasy football. I'd project him to be a high-end tight end too with upside week in and week out. Add Odell Beckham. So like I said, the Ravens are going to have to rely on a lot of their weapons to help replace Mark Andrews. And one of those weapons is Odell Beckham. OBJ is low-key having a great season. According to Next Gen Stats data, among the 120 wideouts with 100 or more routes run this year, Beckham ranks 22nd in yards per route run. He's 24th in targets per route run. He's been the best Ravens wide receiver by far within those two metrics. A reason that he hasn't been better in fantasy football is that his route participation, his playing time, hasn't exactly been there. His 30.4% target share was great in week 11, but he still ran a route on just 48% of Baltimore's dropbacks. Now, the hope here is that OBJ's snap share, it increases down the stretch for Baltimore without Mark Andrews. They've run out of 11 personnel this year, 3 wide receiver sets at one of the lower rates in football. But there's a chance that we see an increase there with Andrews sidelined. So OBJ is worth an add this week. Sell Saquon Barkley. So look, this transaction has nothing to do with how good I think Saquon Barkley is. I actually think that he looked amazing in week 11. He caught 4 or 5 targets for 57 yards and 2 touchdowns. But New York's not going to play Washington each week, and that's a real problem. Barkley has only faced 2 teams this year who rank as a bottom half opponent in adjusted fantasy points allowed. So he's arguably only had 2 tough matchups, and they were both against Dallas. In those 2 games, he scored 9.3 and 7.1 PPR points. And his other 6 games played, he's averaged about 20 PPR points per contest. And from here on out, New York's schedule is not going to be very easy. Over the next 4 weeks, it ranks 7th toughest in football. And in the fantasy playoffs, they get matchups against the Saints, Eagles, and Rams. LA is the easiest matchup of that group, at least by adjusted fantasy points allowed. And they're the 22nd best matchup for running backs within that metric. I would not expect week 11 to be the norm for Saquon Barkley. Add Zach Charbonnet. So considering how much I've talked about the Seattle backfield this offseason and in season this year, Zach Charbonnet is probably rostered in your league. Hopefully he is at least. And hopefully it's your team that has him. Because Kenneth Walker's hurt. He has an oblique injury. His timetable to return is completely unknown at the time of this recording. But he was rolled out fairly quickly in that week 11 game. Charbonnet ended up seeing an 84% snap share. That was actually the highest from any Seahawks running back this year. Now, Charbonnet's performance wasn't great, and that was a bummer. He scored 12.9 PPR points, even though he saw 75% of the team's running back rushes and a really strong 15.8% target share. And unfortunately, Seattle's about to hit a really rough stretch of games. They get the 49ers, Cowboys, the 49ers again, the Eagles, and the Titans over their next 5. None of those matchups are plus matchups by adjusted points allowed to running backs. But regardless of the tough schedule, you need to roster a player who has a real chance to be a bell cow. Now keep an eye on reports about Walker because at this moment, the length of his absence is completely unknown. Add Tutu Atwell. Another high-profile injury in Week 11 was with Cooper Kupp. It sounds like it's a low ankle sprain, but he might not be able to go this week. And if he doesn't go, Tutu Atwell is definitely in play. Because without Cooper Kupp this year, Atwell has averaged a target share per game rate of 22.5% and 14.4 PPR points per game. With Kupp, those numbers are 12.6%, so about 10 percentage points lower in target share, and 6.3 PPR points per game. The Rams get the Cardinals this week too. Arizona's a favorable matchup for wide receivers. So Tutu Atwell without Cooper Kupp definitely can find your lineup. Buy Austin Eckler. Look, I don't know if this needs to be said or not, but I would not be panicking about Austin Eckler right now. Not at all. Yeah, he only had a 7-point performance against the Packers. And yeah, his target share was lower than most weeks at only 8.3%. But his route participation was actually a season high in week 11. And on top of that, there's a chance, a very real chance, that Austin Eckler is going to bring home a lot of fantasy titles this year. In week 15, the Chargers get the Raiders. That's a top 10 matchup for running backs in adjusted fantasy points allowed. Then it's Buffalo, another top 10 matchup. Buffalo ranks 10th. And then in week 17, it's Denver. Denver's been a team that all season has not been very good against the run. I know they've been better defensively, but that's still a weakness for them. There's no reason to panic about Austin Eckler. If anything, I would aggressively be buying him. Add Jayden Reed. So similar to the Zach Charbonnet recommendation, if Jayden Reed's not rostered in your league, that would be surprising if you're listening to the show each week. Because I'm a Jayden Reed stan. I feel like I talk about Reed at least once a week on this show. But I need to bring him up again because he's still out there in 64% of Yahoo leagues. The Packers this year have had a really frustrating wide receiver rotation. No Green Bay wideout this past week, had an 80% snap share. But I would argue that they should be using their rookie wide receivers a lot more than they are. On the season, 4 Packers wide receivers have run 100 or more routes. Those 4 are Romeo Doubs, Christian Watson, Jayden Reed, and Dontavian Wicks. Dontavian Wicks actually leads that group with a 2.03 yards per route run rate. And just below him is Jayden Reed at 1.93. Those are very good yards per route run numbers for rookies. Romeo Doubs is at 1.37, significantly lower. And then Christian Watson at 1.28. Doubs leads the team in targets per route run, Reed is second, Wicks is third, Watson's fourth. Even still, even with all of that, Doubs and Watson are usually the ones that are running the most routes for this team week in and week out. That's been a problem for Jayden Reed because it limits his upside. But he's still found a way to be fantasy relevant over the last couple of weeks with 2 19-point outings. We should be gobbling up talent for our benches. And Jayden Reed and Dontavian Wicks to a degree too. But Jayden Reed has that talent. And he's been used even on the ground a lot too. So please roster Reed. This is the time of year where we should really be looking at rookies. And it doesn't hurt that Green Bay has the 6th best wide receiver schedule in the fantasy playoffs by adjusted fantasy points allowed. Sell or hold Trevor Lawrence. Week 11 was an awesome week for Trevor Lawrence. It marked the first time all season that he scored more than 18.1 standard fantasy points, and he posted over 32. But that's exactly the problem, right? He hasn't done this all season long. He hasn't been very good this year. He was strong against the Titans, but Tennessee doesn't have the best secondary in the world. And Lawrence outperformed expectation. Don't get me wrong. He had a great game. I don't want to take that away. But he did it against a beatable defense, and he needed 2 rushing touchdowns to really get to that ceiling, to really get there. Basically, I don't think this is the start of some run for Trevor Lawrence. Jacksonville does get a couple of plus matchups over their next 2. They get Houston and Cincinnati. Maybe he'll be fine in those spots. But then after that, in really key matchups in fantasy football in weeks 14 and 15, they get the Browns and the Ravens. Trevor Lawrence is probably unstartable in those games. And then in week 16, they get Tampa Bay. That's a plus matchup. But then the fantasy football championship, they get Carolina. And the Panthers have actually been the 3rd best team in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks this year. They're not a great matchup. So if you take a step back, Lawrence has 3 really tough matchups and then 3 decent ones remaining. So he's not a must sell as a result of that, but he's definitely not something I'd be plugging into my lineup week in and week out no matter what. If you can sell high, I think it's totally fine. If not, it's fine to just play him in those plus matchups. Add Rashid Shaheed and A.T. Perry. So Michael Thomas, it sounds like he's going to be out for a decent amount of time. That should boost someone like Chris Olave's target share a little bit. That's a good thing for Olave managers. But Rashid Shaheed, he should see more work too. The last time we saw the Saints, he had a season-high 22.5% target share with Michael Thomas getting injured. And then on top of that, he had an 80% route participation rate. That number usually hovers around 70%. So there was an uptick for Rashid Shaheed in that game. But there was a bigger uptick for A.T. Perry. In week 10, the last time the Saints played, Perry tied Chris Olave for the most routes run on that team. He played 9 more snaps than Rashid Shaheed. He was lining up on the outside when Shaheed played half of his snaps from the slot. So I think Shaheed is the one that you probably should prioritize because we've seen it this season and we know he has big playability. But don't sleep on A.T. Perry either. Buy Kyler Murray. So if I'm being honest with you guys, I'm not sure what the market really thinks about Kyler Murray right now. What I have seen for a long time at this point is that people think that Kyler Murray isn't good because he's not elite. But you don't need to be elite to be good. Kyler Murray's a good quarterback. He may not be this high-end top 3, top 4, top 5 guy in the league, but Kyler Murray's not bad. And he's a really good fantasy asset because of what he can do with his legs. In 2 games this year, we really haven't seen any signs of Murray's ACL repair slowing him down. He's rushed for a touchdown in both games. He's added 84 yards on the ground. That's an awesome thing to see. Now, he's faced 2 pretty easy opponents in the Falcons and the Texans. That's probably helped contribute to his 17.3 and 21.7 fantasy points scored. But Arizona's quarterback schedule in the fantasy playoffs in particular, it's pretty nice. They do get San Francisco in week 15, but in week 16 and week 17, it's the Bears and then the Eagles. Those are 2 top 10 matchups for quarterbacks. If someone's worried about the passing numbers for Kyler Murray, or maybe someone just has Kyler Murray on their bench, and that's very possible given that Murray was an ad in a lot of leagues. If that's the case, try to snatch him away. He should have a nice end to his season. Add Greg Dulcich. Now look, anytime there's a potential usable tight end on the waiver wire, he's probably going to get a shout on this show. And that's what we're looking at with Greg Dulcich, maybe. Dulcich can technically return from IR. But there hasn't been that much information around Dulcich since he re-aggravated a hamstring injury back in week 6. I did do a little bit of digging, and I did find an article with a quote from Sean Payton about Dulcich. And that quote said, quote, "I think we'll see him this year, yeah." So there's at least something. There's at least something saying that Dulcich is going to find the field again this season. Now, for those of you who are here over the offseason, you know that I like me some Greg Dulcich. His peripherals during his rookie season were really, really good. So if you have a deeper roster or you just need a tight end, which a lot of you probably do, throwing that dart with Dulcich and hoping that he's healthier than what's being reported isn't that bad of an idea right now. Add Gardner Minshew. If you need a quarterback streamer this week, I don't mind Gardner Minshew. Indianapolis gets Tampa Bay, and the Bucs have been an above-average matchup for quarterbacks this year by adjusted fantasy points allowed. Now, they've faced tough competition of late, but they've given up a top 3 quarterback performance in 4 of their last 6 games. Jared Goff, Josh Allen, CJ Stroud, and Brock Purdy each hit 320 yards passing against the Bucs. Now, Minshew has not been great in fantasy football, but he's also faced a pretty tough schedule. Only 1 of his 6 starts this year has come against a top half opponent by adjusted fantasy points allowed. 4 of his games have come against bottom 7 matchups. So this is a pretty good spot for him, all things considered, and there's not a lot out there. I think Minshew's a decent streamer. Add the Denver Broncos defense. The Broncos defense has shown a lot of life over their last 3 games. They've been a top 10 defensive unit in fantasy football in all 3 of those contests. And those 3 games were against the Chiefs, Bills, and Vikings. That's not easy competition. This week, the Broncos get the Browns, and they're playing in Denver. According to FanDuel Sportsbook, the Broncos are 2.5-point favorites, and the over-under is just 36.5 points. At the very least, they should provide a floor against Dorian Thompson-Robinson. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter, @LateRoundQB, follow the Instagram account, @LateRoundFF, and make sure you check out YouTube, youtube.com/@LateRoundFF. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll drop 2 episodes tomorrow. I'll talk to you then.